Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
To the satisfied soul, every sweet thing seems bitter, but to the hungry soul, even the bitter seems sweet. Do you see what it's saying? Like, if you're not satisfied in the natural sense, in the healthy sense of being satisfied in any one of your appetites, whether it's your sexual appetite, your spiritual appetite in worship of the Lord, or whatever it is, if you're not satisfied in the natural way, you will then lust after something else. But if you're getting filled up with the healthy, with the good, with the natural, then you don't have that lust for something else.
Have you ever noticed that sin multiplied equals consequences multiplied? We go on serving our flesh until faced with the painful question, can it be any worse? Today in the book of Ezekiel, God compares Samaria and Judah to two unfaithful sisters who kept running after idols and rebellion, refusing to learn from judgment. When it's all said and done, Jerusalem is pictured as a boiling pot filled with corruption that can no longer be cleansed without fire. Even Ezekiel's personal grief becomes a warning sign to the people. These chapters remind us that sin unchecked only grows deeper, but God's warnings are meant to call us back before it's too late. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, Can It Be Any Worse?
Join us tonight in the book of Ezekiel. We'll pick up where we left off. Ezekiel 23 is where we will be beginning. I will remind you of the sections of the book where we're at. We looked at the open of the book for 3 chapters was the Lord calling Ezekiel into this mission of pronouncing all of this. All of it really is future, if you think about it. Nearly everything Ezekiel is doing is a future prophecy. The section that we're completing today in chapter 23 and 24 is the section of his messages against Judah, his kindred there in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. But it was all prophecy of Babylon to come, that they were coming back. And the next section we're going to get into is prophecies that he gave to the surrounding nations. And we'll look at that next. Even those are prophecy. And then when we get to chapter 33 through the end of the book, they are all, I want to say that they're all future prophecies, but really chapter 33 through 39, nearly every one of those has already happened within the last 100 years. It just happened in the last 100 years, except for, of course, Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. We'll get to those. And then when we get into chapter 40 through the end of the book, and believe it or not, it looks like it's a lot there, 9 chapters to finish the book, but we will finish that entire section in 2 sessions. That will go pretty quickly because much of it is a literal blueprint in paragraph form. So we'll get to that. You can look it up ahead of time if you want to get ready yourself for those chapters. But we'll cover that last section in just 2 sessions. I can't say that for the 4th section. That 4th section will take us quite a while to pop through. So here we are tonight, finishing up chapter 23 and 24. These messages directly to Israel and Judah. The Lord has been taking much of these last 21 chapters to describe to Israel in vivid picture where they'd gone wrong and how they can recover. He never just gives them a chapter of, here's how you've messed up. Now, goodbye, I'm going back to my throne. He doesn't ever do that. He always gives them the information for why they went wrong, how they went wrong, but what to do about it. It's always included. It's important to recognize that God is the type of God that he will not judge somebody without an opportunity to understand it and without an opportunity to repent and come away from it and have it not even happen. There's always those opportunities, even today for us. And so, when you look at these last several chapters, and we've been talking about the judgment coming upon Jerusalem and Judah, if you think to yourself, like, man, here we are, we're going to read another chapter about judgment to come. Well, you could look at it that way if you want, but another way to look at this is he's giving them 21 chapters of, please guys, please, would you just please repent? Would you just please change this so I don't have to do this? Isn't that legitimately another way to look at this? This is 21 chapters of the Lord saying, this doesn't have to be. He spends so much time talking about these things to get that point across. You don't have to go through this. You can repent. You can change this. Judgment doesn't have to come. And so when I read 21 chapters of judgment to come on Judah, I not only think to myself, wow, God is serious about judgment, but I also think to myself, what grace? What grace that he would take all this time to just get more and more of these individuals to change their mind and come into a true relationship with him. And so we will finish up this section here tonight. We end this section of Ezekiel with a message titled, "Can It Be Any Worse?" Pretty apt title for the very last couple of chapters of this section of judgment. I mean, what else could he possibly say to them? How can you make it any worse? He's already told them of so much of how Babylon is going to come in and wipe them out and to haul them off captive to where he is currently in Babylon. And so we're going to look at 3 ways in which Judah has exacerbated their sinful situation and actually made it even worse. I mean, it's one thing to be judged for sin, but it's another thing to really press into it. If I'm going to sin, I'm really going to do it well. And we see ways that they make it worse on themselves in these chapters tonight. So chapter 23 is where we'll begin as we finish out this section. This entire chapter of chapter 23, we will position this way. One way you can make a sinful situation worse is by not learning from other people's sinful examples. That makes it worse, right? Have you ever, were you the younger brother that you didn't learn from your older brother getting beat up or smacked around or in car wrecks or punished by mom and dad or whatever else? Like, that was me, right? And I didn't learn from the way I should have learned. I had to go through it myself. And that makes a situation worse on you. And so this chapter 23, many commentators call this the parable of the 2 sisters, because this whole chapter, Ezekiel is told to give a picture to Judah of themselves and their quote-unquote sister, Samaria. You remember all these years, but after the King David and Solomon, then the kingdom divided, right, into 2 halves. The northern kingdom was headquartered in Samaria. And that's going to be this older sister in the story that we're going to look at here. Her name is going to be given as Aholah, which this is a symbolic name for what the name means. And then Judah, who Ezekiel is talking to here specifically, is going to be given the name Aholibah. And this just is, again, a symbolic name. We'll get into the meaning of this. But the idea is Judah, who he's talking to here, didn't learn from all that Samaria and the northern kingdom had gone through. They should have watched how God judged them and turned from their sins. And they didn't do it. And so that's going to be this comparison that we're given here in Ezekiel chapter 23. And so let's begin this here in chapter 23, verse 1. And it says, "The word of Yahweh came to me again, saying, Son of man, there was 2 women, the daughter of one mother." In other words, they're sisters, right? "And they played the harlot in Egypt. They played the harlot in their youth. There their breasts were pressed, and their virgin bosoms were handled." In verse 4, their names were Aholah the elder, representing Samaria, we'll see, and Aholibah, her sister, and that's going to represent Judah, who he's directly talking to, that we'll see. "And they became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. And as for their names, Samaria is Aholah, and Jerusalem is Aholibah." So he even comes right out and says it. Okay? So in the verses, he tells us, I'm making a comparison. I'm making a picture of something. So if we know that this is a made-up story, a pretend story to illustrate a very real point about Samaria and Judah, then what can we learn from this? Well, it says they are clearly the children of one mother. Okay, they're relatives. We get that. They played the harlot in Egypt, and they played the harlot in their youth. Well, when was that? That was when God first called them as a nation. When they were first being called as a nation, Jacob's descendants, remember the 70 descendants of Jacob went down into Egypt at the famine. You remember that under Joseph? And in Egypt, they were adulterous and they were against God. And God called them out of that mess under Moses. So this is the time period of what we're talking about here in verse 3 and verse 4. When he was just forming them as a nation, they were already an adulterous people. You know, if you think to yourself, well, that's kind of strange. Well, Abraham was too, right? Remember, Abraham was into all kinds of, and his father Terah, they were in all kinds of false gods down in Babylon at the time, in Ur of the Chaldees. And so all of Israel is here being seen as unfaithful from the very beginning. worshiping Egyptian gods, and committing all of these, the physical adulteries that came with it. You know, if you have the spiritual adulteries, that's going to eventually come out as physical adultery as well. And we see that. And by the way, you will absolutely notice that this chapter is absolutely rated R as we go through it. Okay. If you see language in here and you think, well, I wonder if he's talking about that, no, he is. Okay. It's as graphic as you can imagine in this chapter. So just as if young children are listening to this after the fact on the recording, just understand that this is this is the adult class tonight, right? Are you the adult class tonight? Okay. So you can handle this, but you'll definitely see that language as we go through this. And so now we got the picture of this analogy that the Lord is drawing out and how it all begins even in adultery. That they're even when God was forming them as a nation, they were adulterous and idolatrous. In verse 5, Aholah, and we got to remind ourselves now as we go through, who is Aholah? That represents Samaria. This is the northern 10 tribes that have already been judged and done away with. And that's who we're going to begin with here in verse 5. Aholah played the harlot while she was mine, and she lusted after her lovers, after the Assyrians, her neighbors, who were clothed in purple, governors and officials, all of them desirable young men, horsemen riding on horses. In verse 7, she gave her harlotries to them, all of them the choicest men of Assyria, and with all whom she lusted after, with all their idols she defiled herself. She, in verse 8, she did not forsake her harlotries from the time of Egypt, for in her youth men had lain with her, and they handled her virgin bosom and poured out their harlotry on her. And so at this point, as you're reading about her harlotries, you're reading about not only was she committing adultery in Egypt, both physically and spiritually, but now even as they get into the land, you have a picture here of Samaria in the north, even now committing adultery with what? With the Assyrians. That was their neighbors to the north and to the east of where they were in northern Israel. You already know some of the great irony with this, right? Here they are. Let's go find out who these Assyrians are. Let's meet our neighbors. And they end up falling for them. They end up lusting after them and their culture. And you know the end of that story, right? That's who ends up taking them captive. Isn't that always the way this world leads us? Like, oh, come look at us. Gotcha. Right? There's something I was thinking about recently that really kind of strikes home with this. All of this lusting after other people's culture and the things of this world. I was recently reminded of Proverbs 27, I think it's verse 6 or verse 7. It says basically, to the satisfied soul, every sweet thing seems bitter, but to the hungry soul, even the bitter seems sweet. Do you see what it's saying? Like, if you're not satisfied in the natural sense, in the healthy sense of being satisfied in any one of your appetites, whether it's your sexual appetite, your spiritual appetite in worship of the Lord, or whatever it is, if you're not satisfied in the natural way, you will then lust after something else. But if you're getting filled up with the healthy, with the good, with the natural, then you don't have that lust for something else, right? You guys ever gone over to Shady Maple, right? And the big smorgasbord over there, right? You walk in the door and you're like, and you see, the first thing you see is like the pies. And you're like, oh, when I'm done eating, I'm getting those pies, right? They got the banana cream, they got the apple, they got all the things, they got them in the hot things. They're ready for you, right? By the time you get done with your 8th plate of meat, gentlemen, right? But and then your wife is like, so let's go get some pie. And you're like, oh, I'm good, right? Like by that point, like even the pie, you're just like, can't do it. I'm done. I'm satisfied right here. I'm good. Right? And it's the same way spiritually and even with our marriages and all of these other analogies that are being put in here. If we're satisfied in the natural sense, you want to know how to stop your lusts and your cravings for things of this world? Get satisfied with the Lord. Get satisfied with your godly relationships. And that will prevent us from lusting as this whole picture is nothing but lusting after other things. Oh, look at the Assyrians. They look shiny and cool. Let's go find out what they're all about. And we're going to see that that's who drags them down, right? How sad is that? And I have no idea what my notes say because I didn't read any of my notes for any of this so far. This is really weird. But maybe that's just what the Lord's doing tonight. So let's just continue in verse 9. Verse 9, therefore I gave her into the hand of her lovers and into the hand of the Assyrians. There it is, after whom she lusted. Verse 10, they uncovered her nakedness. They took her sons and her daughters, but they killed her with the sword. Thus she became a despised name among the women, and they executed judgments on her. Isn't that just like every lust and every addiction of this world, right? It starts off with, with a desire. Oh, we just want to be like them. They're so cool. Oh, they got something to offer us. We want to be like the world. We want to be like these other cultures. And then before you know it, you're enslaved by them. And there's no escape. And they've got their hooks in you. And you can't get out. And you're addicted. That's always the way it works. And here already by verse 9 and verse 10, we already see this lust has become an addiction, which has become a prison to them. And he's just setting up the northern kingdom. This is the example of what happened to them. And Judah and the south, they should have been watching this. Northern Samaria, they fell to the Assyrians like 200 years before Ezekiel's writing this. They should have known this history of what happened to them. So verse 11, now we're going to kind of switch gears, and now he's going to look at Jerusalem and Judah. In verse 11, now her sister Aholibah saw this, yet she was more corrupt in her lust than she, and her harlotries were more than the harlotries of her sister. She lusted after the Assyrians, governors and officers, the ones near, magnificently dressed, horsemen riding on horses, all of them desirable, choice men. In verse 13, and I saw that she had defiled herself. They both took the same way. Isn't that amazing that verse 12 looks nearly identical to verse 7, what Samaria had done? It's like he's just repeating it. She did the exact same thing. She went after the same lusts. She looked at the culture of this world. She looked at certain people and she was like, wow, I need that too. I mean, hello, how about slowing down to think about the fact that you already had an example of where that led to. So now we see Jerusalem or Judah. And you might say to yourself, well, how is it that Judah or Jerusalem, how is their sins actually worse? He says that here, right? In verse 11, he said her sins were more. She was more corrupt. Well, how is that? Well, in that Jerusalem saw Samaria's sins and Samaria's judgment, and yet committed the same thing. That's a sin all of its own. That you have a knowledge of what you're doing is wrong. You've seen God come against it, and then you spit in the face of God and you say, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. Wow. Where there is knowledge of sin and judgment, there is great accountability. And that's the idea here. I mean, the verse itself in verse 11 and 12 is identical to what Samaria had done. What's worse is they knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong, and they did it anyway. And so verse 14, so she increased her harlotries, and she saw men portrayed on the wall, images of the Chaldeans, and now we've got another culture that she's lusting after. The Chaldeans were an ancient race of Babylonians, right? And so she saw men portrayed on the wall. Let me just explain that, by the way, there in verse 14. This is the newspaper of the day, okay? This is what they did. They wrote their history on the walls. And so the idea is that Judah and Jerusalem, they're looking at the Babylonian culture and their history and like, oh, wow, this is a fascinating people. I just read their newspaper on the wall the other day, and I really like these people. We should be like them. That's the idea of where he's going here with verse 14. Images of the Chaldeans portrayed with vermilion, girded with belts on their loins in verse 15, with flowing turbans on their heads, all of them looking like officers, in the likeness of the Babylonians in Chaldea, the land of their birth. That's interesting. Verse 16, and she saw them and lusted after them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. So it's not enough that she wants to be like the Assyrians. Now she's still looking around. She's like, wow, maybe we should be like these Babylonians too, these Chaldeans. They're great. We should be like them. Never mind their heavenly citizenship. Right? Every one of us should be thinking that if we want to be like a culture, we should be like Christ. That's the culture that we should be like. Whatever Christ looks like, that's our culture. That is what the Christian should be thinking. Not, well, let's look at the next fad that comes along. Oh, bell bottoms are back. Great. No, I'm just, really a spiritual culture is what we're talking about. Okay. Instead of looking at the spiritual climate of the world, have you seen Christians fall for the latest spiritual fad that comes around? Right? Meditation came back around for the longest time. This idea of not the type of biblical meditation of filling your mind with Christ, but the type of meditation of emptying your mind, like Eastern mysticism. And that swept through the church for a while. The whole emergent church movement that started around the year 2000 or so. And there's these fads that sweep through, and you watch people get caught up in their stuff. Like, oh, wow, let's look at that cool spiritual culture that's happening. Let's do that, instead of just staying on the biblical culture of what Christ has called us to. And so they're looking at Babylon's culture. They're enamored with it. This is long before Babylon would conquer Judah. And here we have Judah lusting after Babylon to be like them. Oh, if we could just be like the Babylonians. Do you remember? You might even remember. Do you remember when Hezekiah was going to die, and he actually prayed to have his life extended? And in the time of the extension of his life, he committed a great sin. You might remember. He was generally a good king, but he committed a great sin. He showed off to the Babylonians. He showed off the kingdom to the Babylonians. He brought them in, showed them the storehouses. Look at this great kingdom of ours. And that would be one of the triggers that would end up causing Babylon to come back in these days of Ezekiel and judge them and want to take over because of them knowing how rich they were in this area. So long before they were judged by Babylon, they were trying to cozy up to Babylon and be just like them. Now, it is interesting there that it said in the verse, I think it was verse 15, these Babylonians of the land of their birth. The forefather, the father of Israel, really, Abraham. Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. This is where Abraham came from. Abraham was called out of these very sins, these very lusts, this very culture of Babylon is what Abraham was called out of. So make no mistake about it. Israel knew, don't go back to that. They could have read the stories of Abraham. They could have read about how God called him out of, not just out of the land of Babylon, he called him out of the lusts of Babylon, right? So the same idea as when God called them out of Egypt, right? Leave all that behind. He also called them out of Babylon in the sense of he called Abraham out and said, you're not going back there. I've set you apart as different. And yet Judah was always looking to their idolatrous past, whether it was the past of Egypt or the past of Babylon, and thinking, wow, maybe we should look into their history and be like them. And God's like, no, I got a different citizenship for you altogether. And be satisfied in that. And so we continue here in verse 17. So the Babylonians came to her in the bed of love and defiled her with her harlotries. The same bed that used to be fun to her is now seen as it's a defilement to her. Then she became defiled by them, and what? Her soul became disgusted with them. The same thing that started off as, this is fun, I'm just sleeping around, and you got a different girl every night, it's so great, is now all of a sudden torturous. All right? It's finally seen for what it is. Right? And her soul became disgusted with them. Verse 18, and she uncovered her harlotries and uncovered her nakedness. Then my soul became disgusted with her, as my soul had become disgusted with her sister. In verse 19, yet she multiplied her harlotries, remembering the days of her youth when she played the harlot in the land of Egypt. She lusted after their paramours. Verse 20, you may have the word concubine there. This word is typically translated concubine. Some of you may have the word paramour. The idea, really, you know what that is? That is a sexual servant. That's what that is, a servant for the purposes of sex. She lusted after her paramours, whose flesh is like the flesh of donkeys and whose issue is like the issue of horses. Yes, that means what you think it does. Verse 21, thus you longed for the lewdness of your youth when the Egyptians handled your bosom because of the breasts of your youth. And I mean, it's graphic. It's designed to be that way. It took it, right, didn't it? It took it from this place of, oh, this is fun to us. Oh, we're just experiencing other cultures and we're doing neat things. And then it became an addiction. And now what is it? Now it's just plain out disgusting.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.